The war between Russia and Ukraine is not just about politics, or land, or even power. What if this conflict is the latest chapter in a thousand-year-old story, a story of empires, betrayals, and the fight for identity? Today, we're going to unravel the roots of a crisis that's shaking the world. This is the untold history behind the Russia-Ukraine conflict. To understand why Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine in 2022, we have to go back, way back. Let's travel to the year 988. The city of Kiev, perched on the banks of the Dnipro River, is the heart of a powerful medieval state called Kievan Rus. This was a land of grand cathedrals, bustling markets, and fierce warriors. Kievan Rus was the birthplace of both Russian and Ukrainian identity. But as centuries passed, this unity would fracture, and the seeds of rivalry would be sown. Kievan Rus was a federation of Slavic tribes, ruled by the Rurik dynasty. It was here, in Kiev, that Prince Volodymyr the Great converted to Christianity, forever shaping the spiritual and cultural destiny of the region. For centuries, Kiev was the center of power, culture, and faith for the Eastern Slavs. But history is never simple. As the Mongol hordes swept across the steppe in the 13th century, Kiev was sacked and left in ruins. The once mighty Kievan Rus splintered into smaller principalities. Some fell under the influence of Lithuania and Poland, while others looked east, to Moscow. By the 15th century, a new power was rising. The Grand Duchy of Moscow, later known as Muscovy, began to claim the legacy of Kievan Rus for itself. Moscow's rulers called themselves the true heirs of the Rus, and eventually, the Third Rome. But in the lands that would become Ukraine, a different identity was taking shape, one shaped by centuries of foreign rule, rebellion, and survival. For centuries, the lands of Ukraine were a crossroads of empires. Poland, Lithuania, the Ottoman Turks, and the Russian Tsars all fought for control. But the people of Ukraine never stopped fighting for their own voice. In the 17th century, a new force emerged, the Cossacks. Fiercely independent, the Cossacks carved out a semi-autonomous state on the wild steppes. They fought for freedom, for faith, and for the right to govern themselves. But their struggle would draw them into the orbit of Moscow. In 1654, the Cossack leader Bohdan Khmelnytsky signed the Treaty of Pereyaslav, pledging allegiance to the Russian Tsar in exchange for protection. It was a fateful decision, one that would bind Ukraine to Russia for centuries, but also sow the seeds of future conflict. As the Russian Empire expanded, it absorbed more and more of Ukrainian territory. The Tsars imposed their language, their laws, and their Orthodox faith. But beneath the surface, Ukrainian culture endured, sometimes in secret, sometimes in open defiance. The 19th century brought new challenges. A wave of national awakening swept across Europe, and Ukraine was no exception. Poets like Taras Shevchenko gave voice to a new sense of Ukrainian identity. But the Russian Empire cracked down hard, banning the Ukrainian language in schools and books. The 20th century would bring even greater turmoil to Ukraine, a land already shaped by centuries of struggle. Empires were collapsing, new ideologies were rising, and the world was about to change forever. In 1917, the Russian Empire fell. Revolution swept through the streets of Petrograd and Moscow, and the old order crumbled. For a brief, chaotic moment, Ukraine seized its chance. The Ukrainian People's Republic declared independence, hoping to chart its own course. But freedom was short-lived. Civil war raged across the land. Bolsheviks, nationalists, anarchists, and foreign armies all fought for control. By 1922, Ukraine was absorbed into the new Soviet Union. The Soviet era brought both hope and horror. On one hand, Ukraine became a key part of the USSR, a land of industry, agriculture, and culture. On the other, it became a testing ground for some of the Soviet regime's darkest experiments. In 1932 and 1933, a man-made famine swept across Ukraine. Known as the Holodomor, it was the result of Stalin's brutal policies, forced collectivization, grain requisition, and the crushing of resistance. Millions of Ukrainians starved to death. Entire villages vanished. To this day, the Holodomor is remembered as an act of genocide, a wound that has never fully healed. But the suffering did not end there. The Soviet regime targeted Ukrainian intellectuals, artists, and priests. The Ukrainian language was suppressed. Anyone who dared to dream of independence risked arrest, exile, or execution. Then came World War II. Ukraine became a battlefield once again. Nazi and Soviet armies clashed across its fields and cities. Millions perished, Jews, Poles, Russians, and Ukrainians alike. Entire communities were wiped out. When the war ended, Ukraine was left in ruins, but still under Soviet control. The decades that followed brought both rebuilding and repression. Ukraine became the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, its fields feeding millions. Its factories built planes, tanks, and rockets. But the dream of freedom never died. In the shadows, Ukrainian writers, poets, and activists kept their culture alive. They whispered forbidden songs, wrote secret poems, and passed on their language to the next generation. They waited for a day when Ukraine might be free again. In 1986, disaster struck at Chernobyl. A nuclear reactor exploded, spreading radioactive clouds across Europe. The Soviet government tried to hide the truth, but the world was watching. Chernobyl became a symbol of both Soviet power and Soviet failure. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was crumbling. Protests erupted in Kiev and across Ukraine. People demanded freedom, democracy, and the right to speak their own language. In 1991, the impossible happened. The Soviet Union collapsed. Ukraine declared independence in a landslide referendum. For the first time in centuries, Ukrainians had their own state. But the shadow of Russia still loomed large. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was a moment of hope and uncertainty for Ukraine. For the first time in generations, Ukrainians could speak their language openly, teach their history, and dream of a future shaped by their own hands. But independence brought new challenges. Ukraine inherited a crumbling economy, aging Soviet industries, and a political system riddled with corruption. The country was rich in resources, its black soil, its coal, its steel, but many ordinary people struggled to get by. In the 1990s, inflation soared. Savings vanished overnight. Oligarchs, wealthy businessmen with political connections, rose to power, controlling entire industries and shaping the new nation's politics. Ukraine was pulled in two directions. To the west, Europe beckoned with the promise of democracy, prosperity, and freedom. To the east, Russia remained a powerful neighbor, bound by history, language, and family ties. Many Ukrainians spoke Russian at home, especially in the east and south. Others, especially in the west, felt a deep connection to Europe and a longing to break free from Moscow's shadow. This divide was not just about language or geography. It was about identity, about what it meant to be Ukrainian in a world that was changing fast. In the early 1990s, Ukraine made a fateful decision. It gave up the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal left over from the Soviet era in exchange for security guarantees from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. This agreement, known as the Budapest Memorandum, was meant to protect Ukraine's sovereignty and borders. But as the years passed, those guarantees would be tested. Ukraine's leaders struggled to balance East and West, reform and tradition, hope and fear. In 2004, the world watched as Ukraine erupted in protest. The Orange Revolution was sparked by a rigged presidential election. Millions took to the streets, demanding fair elections and an end to corruption. For weeks, they stood in the cold, singing, chanting, and refusing to back down. Their courage paid off. The election was rerun, and a pro-European candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, emerged victorious. But the struggle for Ukraine's future was far from over. The years that followed were marked by instability. Governments rose and fell. Promises of reform were made, then broken. Corruption remained a stubborn enemy. many Ukrainians grew disillusioned. Some left for Poland, Germany, or Russia in search of work. Others stayed, hoping for change. Meanwhile, Russia watched closely. It used its control of natural gas to pressure Ukraine, cutting off supplies during bitter winters. It funded political parties, spread propaganda, and tried to keep Ukraine within its sphere of influence. By 2013, Ukraine stood at a crossroads once again. President Viktor Yanukovych, under pressure from Moscow, abandoned a long-awaited agreement with the European Union. Instead, he turned back toward Russia. The people's response was swift and passionate. They poured into the streets, demanding a future in Europe, not a return to the past. It began with a single spark. In November 2013, when President Yanukovych refused to sign the European Union agreement, students and activists gathered in Kiev's central square, Maidan Nezalezhnosti. They came with hope, with banners, with songs. They called their movement Euromaidan. At first, it was peaceful. But as winter deepened, the government's patience wore thin. Riot police moved in, beating protesters and trying to clear the square. Instead of scaring people away, the violence only brought more Ukrainians into the streets. For months, Maidan became a city within a city. Barricades rose. Tents filled the square. People from every corner of Ukraine, young and old, rich and poor, stood together, demanding dignity, justice, and a future in Europe. The world watched as the standoff grew more intense. Negotiations failed. Tensions rose. And then, in February 2014, the violence exploded. Snipers opened fire on unarmed protesters. The square became a battlefield. More than 100 people, now remembered as the Heavenly 100, were killed in just a few days. Was in shock. As the world reeled from the annexation of Crimea, a new crisis erupted in eastern Ukraine. In the spring of 2014, armed men seized government buildings in Donetsk, Luhansk, and other cities. They declared the creation of two breakaway people's republics, claiming to represent the Russian-speaking population. But this was no simple uprising. Evidence quickly mounted that Russia was supplying weapons, fighters, and even its own troops to support the separatists. The Ukrainian government launched what it called an anti-terrorist operation to retake the east. The war in Donbass became a grinding, brutal conflict. Towns were shelled. Neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Families fled, leaving behind everything they owned. By the end of 2014, thousands had been killed and over 1 million people displaced. Ordinary Ukrainians stepped up to defend their country. Volunteers brought food, medicine, and supplies to the front lines. Young men and women joined the army, many with little training or equipment. On July 17, 2014, tragedy struck the world. Malaysia Airlines flight MH17, flying from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, was shot down over separatist-held territory. All 298 people on board were killed, men, women, children from 17 different countries. Investigators concluded that the plane was destroyed by a Russian-made missile, fired from rebel-controlled land. The world mourned, and the conflict in Ukraine was thrust back into the global spotlight. In September 2014, and again in February 2015, peace talks in Minsk, Belarus, produced fragile ceasefire agreements. But the guns never truly fell silent. Skirmishes, shelling, and sniper fire continued along the front lines. The war became what many called a frozen conflict, not fully at peace, but not in open war. For the people of Donbass, life was a daily struggle. Children grew up in basements, hiding from shelling. Elderly residents survived on dwindling pensions and humanitarian aid. Families were divided by checkpoints and barbed wire. Meanwhile, a different kind of battle raged in the media. Russian state television painted the Ukrainian government as fascists and the West as aggressors. Ukraine fought back with its own stories, trying to win hearts and minds at home and abroad. Year after year, the conflict dragged on. More than 13,000 people would die before the end of the decade. Millions would be forced from their homes. And yet, the world's attention slowly drifted elsewhere. But Ukraine did not stand still. The country reformed its army, built new alliances, and looked westward for support. A new generation of leaders rose, promising to fight corruption and bring peace. By 2019, a former comedian, Volodymyr Zelensky, was elected president on a wave of optimism. He promised to end the war, unite the country, and bring Ukraine closer to Europe. In the early hours of February 24, 2022, the world awoke to a nightmare. Russian missiles struck cities across Ukraine. Columns of tanks rolled across the border from the north, east, and south. Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation. But to the world, it was clear this was a full-scale invasion. In a matter of days, millions of Ukrainians became refugees. Families were torn apart. Cities like Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Bucha became symbols of both unimaginable suffering and unbreakable resistance. The world watched as Ukraine stood its ground. President Zelensky, once a comedian, became the face of defiance. Ordinary people, teachers, artists, grandmothers, took up arms, built barricades, and risked everything for their homeland. The response was swift and historic. Nations across Europe and beyond imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia. Weapons, aid, and support poured into Ukraine. Millions marched in solidarity, from Berlin to Tokyo to New York. But the cost was staggering. Thousands of civilians killed. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. A new generation of children growing up in the shadow of war. As the months dragged on, the world saw both the horrors of war and the resilience of the human spirit. Stories of heartbreak, families separated, lives lost, dreams shattered. But also stories of hope, rescued pets, strangers helping strangers, and a nation refusing to surrender. The war changed everything. It redrew alliances, reshaped economies, and reminded the world that freedom is never free. Finland and Sweden joined NATO. Europe raced to end its dependence on Russian energy. And Ukraine, battered but unbroken, became a symbol of courage for the world. But the scars run deep. Millions remain displaced. Cities must be rebuilt. And the question of peace, true, lasting peace, remains unanswered. So what can we learn from 1,000 years of tension, tragedy, and hope? History teaches us that borders can change, but the longing for freedom and dignity endures. That the past is never truly past, it lives on in language, in memory, in the choices we make today. The Russia-Ukraine conflict is not just a story of war. It's a story of identity, resilience, and hope. A reminder that even in the darkest times, people can choose courage over fear. As we watch history unfold, let's remember: the future is not yet written. And the lessons of the past are ours to learn or to repeat.